You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. I am Carl Jung, and it's time to awaken your deeper self. What if I told you that everything you've accomplished by 40 was just a warm-up? That according to one of history's most brilliant psychologists, your real life, your true journey, hasn't even started yet? Carl Jung, the man who gave us concepts like the collective unconscious and psychological types, believed that turning 40 wasn't about decline or midlife crisis. It was about awakening. And what he discovered about this transformation will completely change how you see your future. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why 40 might be the most important birthday of your life. Carl Gustav Jung wasn't your typical psychologist. While Freud was obsessed with childhood trauma and sexual repression, Jung was fascinated by something much more mysterious: the second half of life. Born in 1875, Jung lived to be 85 years old, and during his lifetime, he made an observation that most people find either deeply comforting or terrifying: that human psychological development follows a predictable pattern, and the most profound transformation happens right around age 40. But here's what makes Jung's theory so powerful. He wasn't talking about some mystical mumbo-jumbo. He was describing a fundamental shift in human consciousness that he observed in thousands of patients over decades of practice. Today, we're going to explore why Jung believed your journey truly begins at 40, what this means to your life right now, and how understanding this concept can transform your entire approach to aging, success, and personal fulfillment. Jung divided human life into two distinct phases, and understanding this division is crucial to grasping his revolutionary insight. According to Jung, the first half of life, roughly from birth to 40, is what he called the morning of life. This phase is dominated by what he termed the ego, not in the arrogant sense, but in the psychological sense of developing a strong sense of self. During these first 4 decades, we're essentially answering the question, who am I in the world? Think about it. From childhood through your 30s, what are you doing? You're building, you're climbing, you're establishing yourself. You go to school, develop skills, choose a career, maybe start a family, accumulate possessions, build your reputation. This is the age of expansion, expanding your influence, your income, your social circle, your achievements. Jung called this process ego development, and he considered it absolutely essential. You can't skip this phase. You need to build a strong ego before you can transcend it. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung noticed something peculiar happening to his patients around age 40. People who had been successful, who had made it by conventional standards, suddenly found themselves asking different questions. Instead of how can I achieve more, they started asking what's the point of all this? Instead of how can I be more successful, they asked what does success even mean? Instead of looking outward at what they could conquer next, they started looking inward at who they really were beneath all their achievements. This is where Jung's concept of the afternoon of life begins. And according to Jung, this is where your real journey starts. The second half of life isn't about building anymore. It's about becoming. It's not about expansion. It's about depth. It's not about achieving. It's about meaning. Jung observed that people who tried to live the second half of life, according to the rules of the first half, inevitably ended up miserable. These were the people who had what we now call midlife crises, try to recapture their youth, chasing the same goals that motivated them in their 20s and 30s. But Jung saw something different in his patients who embraced this transition. He saw them becoming more authentic, more creative, more spiritually aware, and paradoxically, more fulfilled than they had ever been in their youth. The question is, why does this happen at 40? Jung's answer to this question reveals something profound about human psychology that most people never realize. Jung believed that around age 40, a psychological process he called individuation naturally begins. Individuation is essentially the process of becoming who you truly are, as opposed to who you think you should be or who others expect you to be. During the first half of life, we're largely driven by what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to fit into society. We develop this persona out of necessity. We need to be acceptable to others, to find our place in the world, to be successful by external standards. But the persona is not your true self. It's a carefully constructed image designed to help you navigate the social world. And by age 40, Jung observed the psyche begins to demand something more authentic. This is why so many people experience what feels like an identity crisis around this age. The old motivations stop working. The goals that once excited you feel empty. The image you maintain feels like a prison. But Jung saw this not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to finally discover who you really are beneath all the roles you play. Another crucial aspect of this 40-year transformation involves what Jung called shadow work. The shadow represents all the parts of yourself that you've repressed, denied, or hidden, both the negative aspects you're ashamed of and the positive aspects you never allowed yourself to express. During the first half of life, we often suppress parts of ourselves that don't fit our chosen image or social role. The ambitious executive might suppress their artistic side. The devoted parent might suppress their need for adventure. The responsible adult might suppress their playful, spontaneous nature. Around age 40, Jung observed these suppressed aspects of self begin demanding recognition. This is often experienced as sudden interest in completely new areas, unexpected creative urges, or strong desire to break free from old patterns. People who resist this process often find themselves stuck in repetitive, unfulfilling patterns. But those who embrace it discover parts of themselves they never knew existed. Perhaps most significantly, Jung noticed that the values that drive us naturally shift around age 40. The external markers of success that dominated the first half of life, money, status, possessions, achievements, begin to feel less important. This doesn't mean these things become worthless, but they stop being the primary source of motivation and meaning. Instead, people begin to value things like authenticity, wisdom, spiritual connection, and leaving a meaningful legacy. This shift often confuses people because it seems to contradict everything our culture teaches us about success and achievement. We're told that more is always better, that growth means expansion, that success means climbing higher. But Jung understood that psychological development follows a different pattern. At some point, the focus must shift from quantity to quality, from having to being, from achieving to becoming. Jung was very clear about what happens when people resist this natural psychological transition, and his observations are more relevant today than ever before. What we commonly call a midlife crisis is often nothing more than the psyche's demand for individuation being misunderstood and misdirected. Instead of looking inward for meaning, people look outward for youth. They buy sports cars, leave their marriages, chase younger partners, or drastically change their appearance, all in an attempt to recapture the energy and possibilities of youth. But this approach is doomed to fail, because it's trying to solve a problem of the second half of life with solutions from the first half. Jung observed that these attempts to turn back the clock inevitably lead to greater emptiness and dissatisfaction. You can't go backward in psychological development any more than you can go backward in physical development. Even more common than the dramatic midlife crisis is what Jung called stagnation. People who simply refuse to grow beyond their first half of life patterns. These individuals often become increasingly rigid, bitter, and closed off to new experiences. They continue pursuing the same goals with the same methods, but with diminishing returns and increasing frustration. They become what Jung called old at 40, people who have stopped growing psychologically even though they may continue to accumulate achievements. Jung noticed that these individuals often develop what he called neuroses of the second half of life, depression, anxiety, addictions, and other psychological problems that stem from ignoring the psyche's demand for growth and meaning. Perhaps most tragically, Jung observed that cultures that don't honor the second half of life lose access to wisdom. In youth-obsessed societies, the insights and perspectives that come with age and experience are dismissed as irrelevant or outdated. But Jung understood that the second half of life has its own gifts that are impossible to access in youth. These include the ability to see patterns and connections that only come with experience, the wisdom to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't, the capacity for deep authenticity that comes from knowing yourself fully, and the spiritual awareness that often emerges when external achievements lose their grip. When we ignore or devalue the second half of life, we lose access to these gifts, both individually and collectively. But Jung's vision of life after 40 wasn't pessimistic. Quite the opposite. He saw the second half of life as potentially the most rich, meaningful, and fulfilling period of human existence. Here's why. One of the greatest gifts of embracing Jung's vision of the second half of life is the freedom to finally be yourself. After decades of playing roles, meeting expectations, and maintaining personas, there's incredible liberation in discovering and expressing your authentic self. Jung observed that his patients who successfully navigated this transition often became more creative, more spontaneous, and more genuinely themselves than they had ever been. They stopped trying to impress others and started trying to express their true nature. This authenticity often leads to surprising discoveries. The businessman who always suppresses artistic side might become a painter. The teacher who never allowed herself to be vulnerable might become a counselor. The engineer who ignored his spiritual yearnings might become deeply religious. Jung understood that certain types of knowledge can only be gained through experience, and certain types of wisdom only emerge in the second half of life. This isn't just intellectual knowledge. It's embodied wisdom that comes from having lived through challenges, failures, successes, and losses. This wisdom manifests in several ways. The ability to see the bigger picture rather than getting caught up in immediate concerns, understanding the cyclical nature of life, and being less disturbed by temporary setbacks, recognizing patterns in human behavior and relationships, and developing what Jung called mature judgment, the ability to make decisions based on deeper values rather than immediate impulses. Jung was fascinated by the spiritual dimension of the second half of life. He observed that many of his patients naturally began exploring spiritual questions around age 40, even if they had never been religious before. This wasn't necessarily about organized religion. It was about a deeper questioning of life's meaning, our connection to something larger than ourselves, and what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to bridge the conscious and unconscious minds. Jung saw this spiritual awakening as a natural part of psychological development, not a sign of weakness or escapism. He understood that the questions that arise in the second half of life, questions about meaning, purpose, mortality, and legacy, are inherently spiritual in nature. Another gift of the second half of life is the opportunity to become a mentor, guide, or elder for others. Jung observed that people who had successfully navigated their own individuation process naturally became sources of wisdom and guidance to those still in the first half of life. This isn't about preaching or telling others what to do. It's about modeling authentic living and being available as a resource for those who are struggling with their own development. Jung saw this mentor role as crucial for both individual fulfillment and cultural continuity. The wisdom gained in the second half of life needs to be transmitted to the next generation, or it dies with the individual. Many of Jung's patients experience what could only be described as a creative renaissance in their 40s and beyond. Freed from a need to prove themselves or achieve external success, they discovered new forms of creative expression that were more authentic and personally meaningful. This creativity often took unexpected forms. Some people discovered artistic talents they never knew they had. Others found creative approaches to their existing work. Still others expressed their creativity through relationships, parenting, or community involvement. Jung understood that this late-blooming creativity was different from youthful creativity. It was deeper, more intentional, and more connected to the individual's authentic self. So, how do you actually embrace Jung's vision of the second half of life? How do you navigate this transition successfully and access the gifts we've been discussing? Jung emphasized the importance of paying attention to what he called the inner voice, the subtle messages from your psyche about what you need for growth and fulfillment. This voice often speaks through dissatisfaction with current circumstances, sudden interest in new areas, dreams, or a general sense that something needs a change. The key is to listen without immediately judging or dismissing these messages. Your psyche knows what you need for continued development, even when your conscious mind doesn't understand. Jung recommended actively exploring the parts of yourself that you suppressed or denied. This might involve examining the qualities you dislike in others, which often reflect your own shadow, exploring interests or talents you've never allowed yourself to pursue, questioning the roles and identities you've maintained out of habit rather than choice, and being honest about aspects of yourself you've hidden from others. This shadow work isn't always comfortable, but Jung saw it as essential for individuation and authentic living. One of the most important shifts in the second half of life is moving from external to internal definitions of success. Instead of measuring your worth by achievements, possessions, or status, begin to value things like authenticity and self-expression, meaningful relationships and connections, wisdom and personal growth, contribution to others and legacy, and alignment between your values and your actions. Rather than trying to have all the answers, Jung encouraged embracing the big questions that arise in the second half of life. Questions like, what is my purpose beyond personal achievement? How can I contribute to something larger than myself? What wisdom have I gained that could benefit others? What would I do if I weren't afraid of judgment? What legacy do I want to leave? These questions don't need immediate answers. They're meant to guide your ongoing development and exploration. Carl Jung's insight about the second half of life isn't just psychological theory. It's a roadmap for living a truly fulfilling life. His message is both revolutionary and hopeful. Your best years aren't behind you at 40. They're ahead of you, but only if you're willing to embrace the journey of becoming who you truly are. The first half of life is about building your place in the world. The second half is about finding your place in the universe. The first half is about achieving. The second half is about becoming. Whether you're approaching 40, past it, or still in your 20s and 30s, understanding Jung's vision can transform how you think about aging, success, and the meaning of life itself. Your journey truly begins at 40. Not because your life starts over, but because you finally have a foundation, experience, and wisdom to build something authentically yours. The question isn't whether you're ready for this journey. The question is, are you brave enough to take it? If this resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What questions are arising in your own life right now? And what would you do if you weren't afraid of judgment?